Early in the 1950s, Alice Springs had a pioneer cafe and a pioneers football team. Darwin and the top end, on the other hand, was still coping with post-war chaos. Matters of history and cultural heritage were not high on the list of priorities that Darwin people had. In urging the Minister for Territories, Paul Hasluck, to establish a government archives office in the Northern Territory, the West Australian author, John Ewers, a very prominent author of the time, said that it should be in Alice Springs, not Darwin. In the former town, that is Alice Springs, he wrote in 1951, "The spirit's better, and there were people with vitality." Vern O'Brien, long associated with community history in the Territory, and who arrived here in 1946, believed that while the interest in history and heritage bubbled up in Alice Springs during the 1950s, there was, in his words, not much happening in the north. Another long-time community history activist, Peter Spillett, supported O'Brien. There was, he recalled in 2001, no organisation in Darwin in the 1950s that had heritage or history as its focus. He could not remember any concern at all then with the fate of Darwin's older buildings. Alice Springs' small weekly newspaper, as it then was, the Centralian Advocate, certainly reflected the observations just noted. There were numerous articles in the paper dealing with historical subjects. In 1950, for example, there were stories on the bungalow, that is the former telegraph station, the town's old-timers, the need for a Northern Territory Archives office, the deaths of well-known local identities, the disappearance of the Hotel Alice Springs, a local landmark, a meeting to consider a local museum, the identification of old photographs, place names, explorers, a book on the Northern Territory, the overland telegraph line, Aboriginal rock art of what was then known as Ayers Rock, now of course Uluru, and elsewhere historical trees, historical trees, the mystery of Lewis Lassiter, historical monuments, and plans for a town jubilee. There was a similar trend in the paper right throughout the rest of the 1950s. While Darwin's newspapers, the Northern Standard and the Northern Territory News, did carry some articles on local history, few of these were concerned with community activism in history or the conservation of historical places. And just about all the articles were contributed by the same person. Just about all of them were written by Glenville Pike, who was certainly very prolific, but often highly inaccurate. A further significant factor in attitudes towards cultural heritage concerned growing interest among non-Indigenous Australians about Central Australia's Aboriginal past. As the historian Mickey Dewar observes, while no Aboriginal people published accounts of Central Australia in the 1950s, numerous non-Aboriginal writers, among whom one of the best known was Bill Harney, filled the hiatus. Harney, a very experienced Northern Territory bushman who was married to an Aboriginal woman, did much to popularise places important to Aboriginal people through his writing, public speaking and broadcasting. During the 1950s, the eminent Australian filmmakers Charles and Elsa Chauville produced Jeddah, now rightly regarded as a classic, and Walkabout, a series of popular television programs. Both took viewers to many sites that were significant for Indigenous Central Australians. For 4 long years, they rather floridly wrote in 1959, "We have literally followed in the footsteps of Stone Age men and women with our cameras." As Dewar points out, observers such as Harney and the Chauvilles were attracted to Aboriginal spirituality, and they explored the whole notion of Aboriginality. After the Second World War, she argues, all Australia seemed interested in Aborigines, and there was the beginning of recognition that Aborigines have rights to the land that may override any of the newcomers' claims. Most non-Aboriginal Australians, though, supported assimilationist policies, and they assumed, we now know incorrectly, that Aboriginal traditions were headed for extinction. Biba Burzens points out in her study of Aborigines and tourism in the Northern Territory that during the 1950s, the areas where most Aboriginal people lived in Central Australia were inaccessible to almost all tourists, and other remote areas, such as those popularised in the film Jeddah, were difficult to reach. The main tourist location, opened up in the 1950s, was Ayers Rock, now Uluru. There was no consultation with members of the Aboriginal community about the creation of a national park there in 1958, and they were often kept out of the area until the 1970s. Ayers Rock did, however, Burzens write, provide a glimpse of Aboriginal culture for the visitors. Many saw rock art for the first time and were introduced by Bill Harney, keeper of the rock from 1957 to 1962, to the concept that many features of the natural environment had spiritual significance for Aboriginal people. It is often forgotten that the Northern Territory's first legislation concerned with the protection of cultural heritage, the Native and Historical Objects and Areas Preservation Ordinance, was enacted in 1955, long before similar legislation in any other part of Australia. The first state to enact historic buildings legislation, Victoria, did not do so until 1974. The Territory legislation, this very pioneering legislation, aimed to preserve objects, including some structures and areas considered of cultural value. In introducing the ordinance to the Legislative Council on the 28th of March 1955, the Director of Welfare, the well-known Harry Giese, said, and I quote, "The bill has two main features. Firstly, it provides for the preservation of certain objects of ethnological and anthropological interest in value, that is, objects made by native craftsmen using native tools, such as carvings, paintings, curios and artefacts. Secondly, it provides for the preservation of certain objects of archaeological and historical interest and value." Other members of the Legislative Council strongly supported Giese and the principles of the proposed legislation, although suggestions were made about some sections that needed to be clarified or improved. Tom Ronan, also a well-known author, warned that, I quote, "the actual day-to-day administration of this proposed ordinance will be largely in the hands of people who are either totally or untrained or only partially trained in the matters on which they will be called to take action." And significantly, Giese responded to this concern on the 29th of March by pointing out that the Northern Territory administration had access to a wide range of experts, including anthropologists, archivists and historians. Just as was the case in other parts of Australia from the 1970s onwards, the Territory's first heritage legislation in the 1950s was closely associated with the existence of professional specialists who claimed some expertise in the interpretation and management of cultural heritage. The significance of what we now describe as archaeological heritage, that is, places and objects of former occupation that held the potential to reveal significant insights into the past, was only just beginning to be appreciated in Central Australia during the 1950s. This decade was very much a formative stage in the development of Australian archaeology. Many currently accepted concepts of archaeological theory and practice were developed only after the 1950s. John Mulvaney, the acknowledged father of Australian archaeology and who's just written a wonderful autobiography, I strongly recommend anyone who's interested to read it, was greeted upon his appearance in the early part of the 50s as the so-called new man, whose Cambridge-inspired approach had yet to win much acceptance, either among artefact collectors or professionals. Radiocarbon dating arrived in the middle of the 1950s, but most people believed that Aborigines had been in Australia for no more than 10,000 years. The date only got pushed back after the 50s had finished. Central Australia was outside the intellectual flux that pervaded the climate of museums and anthropological societies of New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia at this time. All the same, the provisions of the 1955 Ordinance that I was talking about a few minutes ago were clearly designed to encompass archaeological artefacts. They did so, I guess, from our point of view, in a rather primitive way. They, for example, gave no consideration at all to the age of objects. What they were really concerned about were objects of ethnic affiliation and variety. And this is clear in the Ordinance's ambiguous wording, in which protection was afforded both to any object, and I'm quoting here, relating to the Aboriginal natives of Australia, which is of ethnological or anthropological interest, and to objects of archaeological or historical interest or value. One explanation for, I guess, the lack of interest in age is that it was still very difficult using existing archaeological techniques to work out how old objects were. It was very difficult indeed. All the same, the Ordinance represented the earliest Australian attempt to legislate for the protection of archaeological heritage. And the reason for that is clear. At this time, Central Australia in particular, but the whole of the Northern Territory, were considered to be pristine cultural landscapes, unaffected by the adulterations of the urbanisation and development experienced in the south. It was vital to maintain this environment and the culture of the Indigenous people who inhabited it. It was considered to be important because it was a heritage for the benefit of the wider Australian community. In the 1950s, before the advent of a museum or a tertiary education institution in the Northern Territory, there was little outward sign of local support in Central Australia for archaeology or archaeological heritage. Occasional reports of the discovery of stone implements, rock art and historical artefacts and sites appeared in the Centralian Advocate and other territory newspapers over the decade. Some of these references are embedded in coverage of visiting expeditions, such as a column on Charles Mountford's visit in the 24th of August 1956 issue of the Centralian Advocate. The apparently slight coverage accorded to such events, however, did mask a growing community awareness of the importance of archaeology. As early as the 22nd of September 1950, the Centralian Advocate ran a column in which Mountford, who was a very well-known national figure, criticised vandalism of rock art at Ayers Rock. There were more stories on rock art damage in Central Australia that appeared in the early 1950s. And one of them, for example, was headed "White Vandals Desecrate Rock Drawings." And it included a piece by Mountford on the danger of this kind of vandalism.